Hey everyone, this is an article by a Kenyan G. Tomaselli. It's titled The Burden of Identity: Doing Research, Moral Panics, and Rules of Intellectual Engagement. The little biography here for Keyan, sorry I was saying it wrong, Keyan G. Tomaselli says, Keyan G. Tomaselli is Distinguished Professor, Dean's Office, Faculty of Humanities, University of Johannesburg. Keyan G. Tomaselli is founder and co-editor of Critical Arts, South North Cultural and Media Studies, and the Journal of African Cinemas. During the years of the research and writing for this book, he was the chair of the Committee on Scholarly Publishing of South Africa, hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa. It says on a website from his like a university website. It says he is author of many books, e.g., The Cinema of Apartheid, Richard Green in South African Films, Forging Creative New Directions, Encountering Modernity, 20th Century South African Film, Appropriating Images, The Semiotics of Visual Representation, and co-editor Cultural Icons. He is founding editor, now co-editor of Critical Arts, South North Cultural and Media Studies, and the Journal of African Cinemas. He is the author also of Contemporary Campus Life, Transformation, Manic Managerialism, and Transformation, published in 2021, a critical management studies satire of the modern university. It says his interests are Persian semiotics, reception analysis and translation as applied within the paradigm of cultural and media studies. So, here we are. Let's go. We may all speak academic languages, but that does not signify a perfect fit of meaning between them. Social experience is what determines meaning. Experience is understood through culture, ways of making sense, which results in different and even opposing sign or interpretive communities, whether or not they are speaking the same language. This chapter, in light of such indeterminacy of translation, offers tentative critical reflections on scholarly communities that operate on the basis of identity politics. Arising from the Western Enlightenment, science's truth-seeking mission requires reason. Reason is predicated upon the individual scientist applying observable methodologies. Quote, it is the individual who thinks, and it is science's abstractions that train thought into rational logic, end quote. My own argument will be that an indeterminacy of translation results from the inscribing effect of an individual researcher's identity into the different scientific practices to be discussed. My prime case study examining Ratta's proposition is drawn from the pages of the South African Journal of Science. It relates to the debates over a controversial commentary using multivariate analysis from which Nicholas Nattrass concluded that black students are largely disinterested in studying biological sciences. Nicole Nattrass born 1961, is a South African development economist who is professor of economics at the University of Cape Town. Nicole Nattrass is the co-editor of the Institute for Communities and Wildlife in Africa and was the founding director of the Center for Social Science Research. Nicole Nattrass's published work is mainly within the field of South African political economy. Nicole Nattrass's research interests include HIV/AIDS policy and denialism, labor-intensive growth, and human-wildlife conflict. She is also known for her 2005 book on inequality in South Africa, Class, Race, and Inequality in South Africa, which she co-wrote with her husband, Jeremy Seekings. Back to the text. A brief comparison is offered with regard to an autoethnography published I don't know why I said self-published, published in in African Studies Review, that like the SAJS, the South African Journal of Science commentary, also drew angry petitions demanding immediate retraction. The methods applied by each study pursuing totally different objectives are very different. However, the instantaneous antagonistic responses, some leveraging identity politics, question the roles of the respective individual researchers. However, the instantaneous antagonistic responses, some leveraging identity politics, questioning the roles of the respective individual researchers, were common to both. The semiotic concept of myth, connotations that have become discursively hegemonic, is applied to explaining the competing discourses and the associated critique of normal science that these two cases have triggered. This chapter then discusses the vexed implications of research identity, researcher position, and the researcher's memberships of scholarly communities. Some implications for journal editors are examined in the context of W.V.O. Quine's theory of the indeterminacy of radical translation. And I've come across Quine before, but I'm going to read his Wikipedia intro. Willard Van Orman Quine lived from 1908 to 2000 and was an American philosopher and logician in the analytic tradition, recognized as, quote, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, end quote. Willard Van Orman Quine was the Edgar Pierce Chair of Philosophy at Harvard University from 1956 to 1978. Quine was a teacher of logic and set theory. Quine was famous for his position that first-order logic is the only kind worthy of the name, and develops his own system of mathematics and set theory known as New Foundations. In the philosophy of mathematics, Quine and his Harvard colleague Hilary Putnam developed the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument, an argument for the reality of mathematical entities. Quine was the main proponent of the view that philosophy is not conceptual analysis, but continuous with science. It is the abstract branch of the empirical sciences. This led to Quine's famous quip that, quote, philosophy of science is philosophy enough, end quote. Quine led a, quote, systematic attempt to understand science from within the resources of science itself, end quote, and developed an influential naturalized epistemology that tried to provide, quote, an improved scientific explanation of how we have developed elaborate scientific entities on the basis of meager sensory input, end quote. Quine also advocated holism in science, known as the Duhem-Quine thesis. Quine's major writings include the papers on What There Is, published in 1948, which elucidated Bertrand Russell's theory of descriptions, and contains Quine's famous dictum of ontological commitment, quote, to be is to be the value of a variable, end quote. And the article Two Dogmas of Empiricism, published in 1951, which attacked the traditional analytic-synthetic distinction and reductionism, undermining the then popular logical positivism, advocating instead a form of semantic holism and ontological relativity. They also include the works The Web of Belief, published in 1970, which advocates a kind of coherentism, and Word and Object, published in 1960, which further developed these positions and introduced Quine's famous indeterminacy of translation thesis, advocating a behaviorist theory of meaning. Back to the text. Quine, in 1960, argued that translation, meaning, and reference are all indeterminate. The multiplicity of experiences in the research encounter and the consequent potential for intelligibility about it varies in accordance, so to speak, with the cultural community of those who are there. Where the Quinean ethnographic encounter occurs, radical translation and its indeterminacy are a function or consequence of the different experiences that constitute the subjectivities of the, quote, native, parenthesis, the subjects of research, end parenthesis, and the, quote, ethnographer, end quote, parenthesis, the researcher, end parenthesis. For authors of this volume, the value of science and scientific truth is understood to be under threat, a consequence of identity politics that is underpinned by discourses of legitimation that characterize the post-truth era. Who is authorized or is un/authorized? Who is authorized or is unauthorized to speak in defense of science? As Ratta observes, quote, decolonization and indigenization are today's expression of the counter-Enlightenment communitarian ethos that has resisted the Enlightenment's liberal democratic ideals since the 18th century, end quote. Ratta. One second. The Ratta being referred to as an Elizabeth Ratta. Sorry, I want to look this person up. Wikipedia says Elizabeth Ratta is a New Zealand academic who is a sociologist of education and a professor in the School of Critical Studies and Education at the University of Auckland. Elizabeth Ratta's views and research on Maori education and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the New Zealand education system have received criticism from other academics as per the academic process. In 1986, she married Te Ika Jack Ratta, the older brother of the politician Matiu Ratta. Elizabeth is Pākehā, noting her ancestors were Pākehā. Back to the text. Below, I apply a Peircean philosophy in trying to answer the question of who is authorized to speak about what. My analysis is located in the vexed context that is contemporary South Africa, where indeterminacies of translation in the pursuit of knowledge and the delimited appropriation of discourse have taken very divergent and sometimes ominous turns. What's Peircean philosophy? I know it's Charles Sanders Peirce, but Charles Sanders Peirce lived from 1839 to 1914 and was an American scientist, mathematician, logician, and philosopher who is sometimes known as the, quote, father of pragmatism, end quote. According to philosopher Paul Weiss, Peirce was, quote, the most original and versatile of America's philosophers and America's greatest logician, end quote. Bertrand Russell wrote, quote, Peirce was one of the most original minds of the latter 19th century and certainly the greatest American thinker ever, end quote. Educated as a chemist and employed as a scientist for 30 years, Peirce, meanwhile, made major contributions to logic, such as theories of relations and quantification. C.I. Lewis wrote, quote, the contributions of C.S. Peirce to symbolic logic are more numerous and varied than those of any other writer, at least in the 19th century, end quote. For Peirce, logic also encompassed much of what is now called epistemology and the philosophy of science. He saw logic as the formal branch of semiotics, or study of signs, of which he is a founder, which foreshadowed the debate among logical positivists and proponents of philosophy of language that dominated 20th century Western philosophy. Peirce's study of signs also included a tripartite theory of predication. Additionally, Peirce defined the concept of abductive reasoning, as well as rigorously formulating mathematical induction and deductive reasoning. Peirce was one of the founders of statistics. As early as 1886, Peirce saw that logical operations could be carried out by electrical switching circuits. The same idea was used decades later to produce digital computers. In metaphysics, Peirce was a, quote, objective idealist, end quote, in the tradition of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, as well as a scholastic realist about universals. Peirce also held a commitment to the ideas of continuity and chance as real features of the universe, views Peirce labeled Cynicism and Tychism, respectively. Peirce believed an epistemic fallibilism and anti-skepticism went along with these views. Back to this text. Back to the... Jesus Christ. Back to the text. Ugh. My mouth does not want to do what it's supposed to. University restructuring and interinstitutional mergers across the South Africa following 1994 were a fast-tracked post-apartheid, initially non-racial political project. Implemented without adequate research or consultation into the cultural, educational, budgetary, or management consequences of such arrangements, the outcomes were sometimes dire, contradictory, and anti-democratic. The political transition also involves the changing place of the individual within the, quote, transforming institution that is the university. The liberalism that had underpinned the ideas of the individual and academic freedom characteristic of the four anti-English language apartheid universities was after liberation admonished and subjugated by a new cadre of instrumentalist managers and academics who imposed a priori assumptions not only on the nature of the university but on the practices of science also, including the continued determinations of race as an unnegotiable ideological frame in governance. Footnote: University of Natal, University of Cape Town, Rhodes University, and University of Witwatersrand. The extension of this opposition varied over time, but became most outspoken during the 1980s. End footnote. The most detailed merger experience is described in The Struggle for the Soul of a South African University by Nithya Chetty and Chris Merritt on the creation of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, UKZN. The description for this struggle for the soul of a South African university, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Academic Freedom, Corporatism, and Transformation by Nithya Chetty and Christopher Merritt says, The Struggle for the Soul of a South African University is a book about governance in higher education. After the University of KwaZulu-Natal, an amalgamation of the old universities of Natal and Durban Westville, was established in 2004, it embraced policies of managerialism, corporate behavior, centralization, and racial quotas. Custodianship for the greater good and collegiality gave way to line management, legalism, and industrial relations. Academic rule collapsed, illustrated most spectacularly by the sidelining of Senate. Collective identity was valued more highly than intellectual achievement. Written as a part polemic by two university insiders, this book charts institutional decline and dysfunctionality, considers the troubled term, quote, transformation, and analyzes the phenomenon of serial crisis. It addresses in depth a string of commissions of inquiry and disciplinary proceedings and explains why these constituted such a major threat to academic freedom that the international academic community expressed extreme alarm. This was well warranted. The institutional and constitutional rights of academics proved illusory. While post-apartheid rights flourished, in one South African university they contracted. Peter Vela, chair of humanities at the University of Johannesburg, described the book as a, quote, riveting read and commends it, quote, its, quote, highly original critical frame, end quote. UKZN continues to function amidst crisis. Its first decade forms a salutary part of the history of higher education in the province and speaks to upheavals at other South African universities. And it says, Nithya Chetty holds a doctorate from the University of Illinois and undertook postdoctoral research in Denmark and the United States. At the time of his dramatic exit from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in December 2008, he was associate professor of and head of the computational physics program. From 2007 to 2009, Nithya Chetty was president of the South African Institute of Physics, during which time he moved to the University of Pretoria, where he was promoted to full professor. He is now deputy CEO at the National Research Foundation, responsible for implementing and coordinating South Africa's astronomy program. Christopher Merritt has a doctorate in history from the University of Cape Town. After a career in copyright and academic libraries, he became university librarian, then director administrator from 1996 to 2002, and 2002 to 2007 on the Peter Maritzburg campus of the University of Natal, UKZN. After his departure from the university, he worked as a journalist for The Witness for 7 years. He is now a freelancer working on various aspects of book publication and chairperson of the Natal Society Foundation Trust. So that's what that book that's being referred to is. Back to the text. As employees of UKZN during the merger, as employees of UKZN during the merger, as was I, they analyzed the divisive and intolerant management practices that resulted from the joining of the Liberal University of Natal with the self-styled, quote, home of the left, end quote, the University of Durban-Westville, UDW, during the mid-2000s. The outcome, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, was the state-mandated conjoining of the small, formerly, quote, Indian single-campus Durban-Westville with the previously, quote, white, four-campus Natal spread across two cities. Though by 2000 both were fully multiracial, a mixing process incorporating black faculty and students that had started after the mid-1980s. The merged institutions, incompatible cultures, discordant administrative systems, and forms of management, accompanied by the imposition of adversarial communication practices, had ignited a kind of capital, top management versus labor, deans, professors, academics, administrative support, and cleaning staff conflict. Strangely, however, the KwaZulu-Natal, University of KwaZulu-Natal students were muted during this period that was squeezing the academic project between a relentless centralizing managerialism on the one hand and a reconfiguring an alienated academic support and service labor force on the other. Footnote: student experiences were not studied at the time, though, quote, fresh insights into the transformation struggle, end quote, from student perspectives are revealed in Schwartz et al. 2018. End footnote. Notwithstanding the traumatic University of KwaZulu-Natal example, 2 decades later, David Benatar's uncompromising The Fall of the University of Cape Town exposes a different conflict configuration where individuals and groups were contesting for legitimacy, sometimes violently. Um, the description of this book on Amazon says, destructive forces have been eroding the University of Cape Town, Africa's leading university. This book tells the sad, true tale of what has been transpiring. It is a saga of lunacy, criminality, pandering, and identity politics. The mad and the bad, the deranged, deluded, the depraved have been granted endless latitude in bullying and abusing others. The decline began in 2015 with the Rhodes Must Fall protest that resulted in the offending statue's removal within a month, and which spawned similar protests abroad. Emboldened by their local success, the protesters issued new and ever-increasing demands later that year, and then again in 2016 and 2017. Their methods also became criminal, including intimidation, assault, and arson. The university leadership capitulated to this behavior, and this fostered a broader and now pervasive toxic environment within the institution. These developments offer important lessons for universities around the world that are yielding to the forces of a faux, quote, progressivism. So that's the book. Who is David Benatar? One second. Wikipedia says David Benatar is born 1966, is a South African philosopher, academic, and author. David Benatar is best known for his work in moral philosophy and for advancing the position of antinatalism, the view that coming into existence is a serious harm. David Benatar is the author of Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, published in 2006. He is the author of, in which he argues that procreation is always morally wrong because it poses harm by bringing sentient beings into existence. Central to this view is his asymmetry argument, which holds that the absence of pain is good, even if no one benefits from it, while the absence of pleasure is not bad unless someone is deprived of it. Benatar has also written on topics including death ethics, human suffering, and gender discrimination. He is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Controversial Ideas. Okay, so back to the text. Notwithstanding the traumatic University of KwaZulu-Natal example, 2 decades later, David Benatar's uncompromising The Fall of the University of Cape Town, published in 2021, exposed a different conflict configuration where individuals and groups were contesting for legitimacy, sometimes violently. Protesters comprising both students and academics are observed by Benatar to have included arson, assault, intimidation, and criminality targeted at specific lecturers deemed to have transgressed the demands of fallism. The Fallists, as in the National Roads Must Fall movement, in March 2015, had demanded the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue on the University of Cape Town campus. The resulting, quote, toxic environment, end quote, argues Benatar, was further enabled by the capitulation of the University of Cape Town leadership to unreasonable student demands and the trusting importation of an unreconstituted American critical race theory. The individual embedded in institutional structures the individual embedded in institutional structure reform. Jesus Christ. The individual embedded in institutional structures performs, as Rata in 2023 argues, as an autonomous social actor. Such individuals are authors of their own actions, as in Benatar publishing his book with a non-scholarly publisher, thereby risking his institutional publication performance target. However, the activist, embedded in a wider intellectual collective, is a heteronymous actor performing from a culturally written script, and in this case, we are told by the University of Cape Town's internal critics. We are told by University of Cape Town's internal critics. Jesus Christ. However, the activist, embedded in a wider intellectual collective, is a heteronymous actor performing from a culturally written script, and in this case, when we are told by University of Cape Town's internal critics, was being written through the American lens of critical race theory. A challenge to normal science is the ensuring of desirable degrees of collegiality within such a conflicted late postmodern environment driven by identity politics. The focusing issue has become one of hybridities of identity and identity formation, as well as the nature of changing identities as specific interpretive communities, sometimes in conflict with each other, as each negotiate contemporary conditions. Normal science assumes that there should be always place for the individual to engage productively in terms of tried and tested scholarly practices. If not, then the tyranny of the community overpowers the freedom of the individual. My chapter in this light offers a tentative critical reflection on scholarly communities that operate on the basis of demonization, exclusion, and excommunication. Elite nationalist, corporate, and left authoritarianism operating from within and throughout the University of KwaZulu-Natal, for example, had made it very difficult to engage with popular politics in an intellectual manner. The University of KwaZulu-Natal remains indicative of the scarring of liberal universities since the onset of the democratic era, especially in the context of the contemporary racializing evolution known as the decolonization of knowledge. The new intellectual persona informed by identity/existentialism/objectivity is now in some intellectual sites shaping the nature of debates on course curricula and in scholarly publications. Footnote. This phrase is Violent Gevers. His policy work for the Academy of Science of South Africa has acknowledged these new identity discourses in the context of the core role of an Academy of Science, Latin, quote, sire, to know, quote, science, meaning, quote, seeking knowledge systematically, end quote. End footnote. Coterminously was the furious debate over Natros's commentary about racial preferences in University of Cape Town student course selection vis-a-vis the biological sciences. Natros was accused by many of her colleagues of doing bad science, racism at worst, in both the popular media and nationally prominent science journal. Some replies to such criticisms did, however, occur in terms of the desirability of rules of engagement and academic freedom. The Natros study is not my focus, but rather to address issues of appropriate academic governance in navigating such contesting identitarian currents. Identarian currents. The concerns are 1. Implications for editors and for science. 2. The restoration of professional civility. 3. Institutional responsibilities. 4. The deeper question of scientific reliability in a society riven with seemingly irresolvable identity issues and epistemological crises. The published literature on workplace civility, however, may be inadequate to the task of understanding what has happened within South African institutions. In the Natros case, communication related to both university governance and scientific matters took place in the public domain, which constituted a possible threat to university collegiality. Campus citizens thus often find themselves in opposing camps, both internal and external to their institutions, while ironically being required to tick performance management boxes that assume a common project on their individual performances and contributions to, quote, decolonization, quote, Pan-Africanism, quote, internationalization, quote, transformation, and even, quote, fundraising. One of the recurrent recommendations from the Academy of Sciences South Africa, ASSAF journal, assessment panels in the South African Journal of Science, SAJS, format is the ideal, e.g. front matter, book reviews, research letters, commentaries, editorials, and other short interventions, and full research articles, The objective of this Catholic scope is to encourage a broadening of content and perspective, a widening of readership, and to enable social impact. Footnote. Wyland Gevers, email, 10th of March 2022. He was a previous chairperson of the Committee on Scholarly Publishing of the Academy of Science of South Africa, was convener of the consensus panels that comprehensively reviewed scholarly publishing in and from South Africa in journals and books. End footnote. The journal's, quote, front section had achieved this goal, evident in the Natros commentary that had immediately attracted, I think that's 13,000 plus views, an astonishing metric for this publication. An extra non-peer-reviewed edition of the journal reproduced in the same or revised form some prior published news media responses in which the merits and demerits of the study she led were very hotly debated. But thereafter, for the first time in its history that started in 1903, the journal now introduced formal assessment procedures for commentaries and reports. The contradiction between quantitative and qualitative research methods is one point of contention in these critiques. Another is the claim that Natros's interpretation of her results reveals a disconnect with the data generated by her multiracial research team. Even so, her critics' conclusions are largely asserted without demonstrating convincing causal links. Having first suggested that her presentation at a faculty seminar be published as a commentary, University of Cape Town management then perversely demanded a retraction from the journal. Academic freedom principles become stressed when university managements interfere with scholarly dialogue. Physicist Nitya Chetty had made the same point with regard to the South African government's alleged instruction that state scientific agencies should refrain from commenting on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The critical question involves the context of embodied theory and methods that in the contemporary conjuncture cannot be easily separated from emotions, politics, beliefs, and values. Imbecility is in such a context to be understood as an indicator of deeper processes buffeting not only the academy, but whole societies also. The criticisms of Natras occurred within the discourse of the globally significant Black Lives Matter movement that finds its University of Cape Town on-campus manifestations, also an IES, and the institutions flirting with critical race theory as a social management mechanism. Social movements such as Fallism and Black Lives Matter are powered by the instigation of moral panics, which arise organically as the result of a buildup of unresolved social issues that appear as threats to the social order. New section. Section 2. Moral panics. A moral panic enables a spiral effect produced by the interaction of media, public opinion, interest groups, and authorities. The key elements of a moral panic as they have occurred within the South African tertiary education context are something, e.g. the university and/or someone, a vice-chancellor, a dean, a researcher, is defined as a threat to the interest of those who claim right reason and social legitimacy. The threat is depicted in an easily recognizable form in the national media, and now social media, email, blogs, etc. Usually for nationwide moral panics, a rapid buildup of public concerns occurs, triggered by a particular event. However, for our sector, the assassination of Professor Gregory Kamwendo at the University of Zululand in 2018 did not trigger anything more than a few news stories. He had exposed a fraudulent PhD mill and paid the ultimate price. I'm not seeing really anything much on Gregory Kamwendo. Gregory Kamwendo had exposed a fraudulent PhD mill and paid the ultimate price. However, the attempted assassination of University of Fort Hare Vice-Chancellor Professor Sakela Bulangu and some of his senior administrators in late 2022 did generate national headlines and ongoing coverage. The attacks were aimed to eliminate attempts to eradicate mafia-scale organized campus fraud. Wikipedia says Sakela Bulungu is a South African sociology professor and university administrator. Sakela Bulungu is the current Vice-Chancellor of University of Fort Hare and former Dean of Humanities at University of Cape Town. Bulungu's work focuses on the labor and other social movements. Sakela Bulungu has also taught at the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Johannesburg and the University of Pretoria. At Fort Hare, his efforts to combat corruption led to threats that culminated in a January 2023 assassination attempt that killed his bodyguard. Before academia, Bulungu worked as a teacher and was the Assistant General of the Paper, Printing, and Allied Workers Union. Back to the text. The panic recedes and or results in social changes. Another one takes its place, or the original one pops up again. Fallism occurred 6 months after #Rhodes Must Fall in October 2015. Another mass-based student-led movement that very physically demanded the ending of course fees in the face of rising tuition costs, financial exclusion, and socioeconomic inequalities. Further follows demands followed, aimed at the Minister of Higher Education and Training, amongst others. Where moral panics historically emanated from regulatory authorities, in the age of social media, ordinary people now are able to generate instant panics with regard to their personal circumstances. The current moral panic bubbles up and mutates repeatedly, whether in the form of fallism or in the use by aggrieved individuals or multiple digital media channels that offer instantaneous exposure in comparison to the legacy scholarly serials that publish only by compiled volume on due dates. The often invisible authors of the panic aim to leverage their own claims of victimology as a result of institutionally authorized folk devils. Such devils are perceived to be misusing their institutional and/or gender and racial powers in complex bureaucracies to victimize their targets. And as Francois van Schalkwijk and Nico Coetta conclude, the highly personal nature of digital communication has a direct impact on collegial relations within the university. I don't see anything for either of these individuals. Oh, that's why I'm not looking them up. The motivations of both faculty and management, as well as the public, quote, extend beyond stimulating collective debate in the service of knowledge production to serving individual and/or ideological agendas as the communication of science becomes politicized, end quote. I now turn to how meaning is made and interpreted, circulated, and socially shaped. Section 3. Communication, Reception, Translation. Reception analysis examines interpretation of content transmitted by signals and signs that need to be interpreted. Cultural studies is concerned not with signal transmission, but with how communities make meaning when interacting with signified content circulated within circuits of culture. The circuit of culture model wraps meaning making within broader social, political, and economic contexts. Wikipedia says, the circuit of culture is a theory or framework used in the area of cultural studies. The theory was devised in 1997 by a group of theorists when studying the Walkman cassette player. The circuit of culture theory suggests that in studying a cultural text or artifact, you must look at 5 aspects: the artifact's representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. Duguay et al. Suggests that, quote, taken together, these 5 points complete a sort of circuit, through which any analysis of a cultural text, must pass if it is to be adequately studied. Gerard Goggin openly uses this framework in his book Cell Phone Culture, Mobile Technology in Everyday Life, in order to fully understand the cell phone as a cultural artifact. Gerard Goggin's book is split into 4 parts: production, consumption, regulation, and representation and identity, through looking at mobile convergences. Back to the text. Briefly, the circuit comprises A, signification, what the thing signified means; B, identity, the agents involved with producing, consuming, and regulating the thing; C, consumption, buying the thing, becoming part of the thing; D, production, labor, reproduction, marketing; E, regulation, the rules, the authorities, and the nature of their enforcement. Where Persian semiotics researches for the, quote, final opinion, end quote, conducting normal science but making space for negotiation aberration, and paradigm change. The Western world, following Trumpian republicanism, found itself on a post-Enlightenment regression into totemism, superstition, and conspiracy, a semiosis that played into the power trajectory of a narrow identitarianism rather than probity, hybridity, democracy, reason, and dialecticism. Dialectism. Semiosis explains variations in decoding, why translation and responses differ, and how messages take on new and different meanings as they navigate, accept, negotiate, and/or reject the social determinations that structure circuits of culture. The legitimation of perceived social experience that eschewed veracity and the evidentiary became ascendant within sections of the academy. The Trump era post-2016 recast the relationship between identity politics and normal science, as occurred in apartheid South Africa and Nazi Germany. When muddled, these discourses get lost in translation, as science becomes subsumed into identity politics, as perhaps indicated in the October 22nd number of Nature that discusses science's racist legacy. This preeminent science journal now seemingly recognizes that the final opinions, even in hard science, is indeed subject to ideological negotiation and not just empirical testing. Peer review, however, is the practice that has driven the scientific system since 1665, then introduced by the first editor of the first scholarly journal, Philosophical Transactions. For authors, peer review is quality control, and for editors and readers, it is an assurance of reasonable scientific validity. For the public, peer review in the medical sciences especially could be the difference between life and death. Why then are claims of legitimation replacing axioms of truth? And why are normal scientific discourse and practices sometimes alleged to be racist, sexist, and identitarian? New section, Section 4, Truth and Social Legitimation. The scientific search for truth has been always muted by the quest for social legitimation, identity politics, and access to power, that is, the power to determine or prescribe truth rather than to simply find truth. Peer review is now subject to populist review in the contemporary world, overwhelmingly driven by social media. Under such circumstances, one fixes the self, capital S self, in terms of belief. Peirce's phenomenology, spelled as phaneroscopy, through an underapplied concept, analyzes the central idea to which signs give rise. According to Wikipedia, the phaneron is the subject matter of phenomenology, of what Charles Sanders Peirce later called phaneroscopy. The term, which was introduced in 1905, is similar to the concept of, quote, the phenomenon, in the way it meant, quote, whatever is present at any time to the mind in any way, end quote. Back to the text. Peirce's phenomenology, spelled as phaneroscopy, through an underapplied concept, analyzes the central idea to which signs give rise, firstness. Phaneroscopy examines identity in the face of the other, secondness, and finds connecting relations of codes, thirdness. Signs elicit responses within interpreters, such that anything that is present in the mind can be accounted for. Such mental content includes apparitions, lies, and the ephemeral. If the ancestors are said to be here with us, then they are indeed considered to be with us, and that a priori is beyond challenge. Phaneroscopy, but not phenomenology, can absorb into its orbit both the material and immaterial, beliefs and facts, as well as their interactions and translations. Phaneroscopy accounts for different modes of being, seeing, and doing. It encompasses that which is present to the mind in a public forum, the social, from that which is present to the individual, scholar, the implied reader, only, and in the meaning projected by the scholar on the implied reader. Phaneroscopy includes the, quote, fixation of belief by tenacity, end quote, e.g. Trumpism, at one extreme, and, quote, fixation of belief by learning from experience, quote, end quote, e.g. the court scientific method logic, at the other. Translation becomes the mediating link between different minds, ontologies, and identities managed through the circuit of culture. The new intellectual persona informed by IES is now in some intellectual sites shaping the nature of debates in popular media, in scholarly publications, and in curriculum design. In other words, now there is a place for sensitive and systematic reflection on what implications or effects a scholar's identity exerts on their research. But as Hall cautions, an overly hasty version of this simplistically says, if you're X, you can only talk about Y, and if you're Z, you can only talk about W. In other words, some responses to Natros were claiming authority without incommensurability. Such analyses of positionality on which a claim to authority rests tend towards essentialism. The claim is twofold. First, that the lived experiences or subject positions of some are essentially untranslatable and inaccessible to those, quote, outside of that identity category, because, second, the practical/political implications that follow are from the realm of the lived. This was starkly revealed in many of the extraordinarily antagonistic responses to the Natros report, amongst others. Two different possibilities are being mooted in these moral panics. A person's lived experience gives access to an epistemic world incommensurable with and inaccessible to that of other groups, while B, a person's lived experience confirms such an individual's authority to pronounce definitively on certain matters because, for example, they're on the receiving end of what they perceive to be a particular kind of injustice. Incommensurability and inaccessibility do not necessarily occur under B. And not all the reactions to Natros asserted option A, untranslatable, inaccessible. Many responses characterized option B. A similar response to an autoethnography of two scholars in African Studies Review, Mara and Thompson, fixated on the socially implied racial identity of the respective authors who were self-reflexively analyzing some of their African fieldwork experiences. Footnote. See the article, A Statement from the Editors of the African Studies Review from May 2022. This statement was in response to a Google Docs petition demanding the retraction of Mara and Daley Thompson, 2022. End footnote. These media-led critiques of both studies aim to authorize who has the right to speak on behalf of whom. They are not accompanied by technical deconstruction of the very different methodologies. Natros's findings had irked the University of Cape Town's Black Academic Caucus, BAC, evocatively described by Chris Merritt as, quote, a race-based political interest group and a social media crowd, end quote. Demands were made by the Black Academic Caucus and University of Cape Town, the South African Journal of Science, I think that's what it means, SAJS, retract the commentary. Merritt observes that, quote, instead of giving the baying mob a lesson about academia, the University of Cape Town executive called the published research offensive and unethical without advancing a shred of evidence. Not only was this reckless populism thoroughly unacademic, but university executives have no business making such pronouncements, ... Natros noted that condemnation had preceded rational debate. In this disgraceful episode, the University of Cape Town executive the University of Cape Town executive behaved not as the custodian of academia, but like a political regime, perhaps like a university in a totalitarian state, end quote. Merritt. Chris Merritt. Myth naturalizes what is already known, always taken for granted, as always having been the truth. C. Bart, 1972. Two sets of myths are at work in their respective critiques of Natras and Mara and Thompson. A. Authors, identified or implied as white and privileged, embodying a, quote, already there-ness, end quote. And B. No matter their credentials, they find themselves positioned within ideological grids of racism, parenthesis, quote, whiteness, end quote, and parenthesis, an ascribed identity from which they cannot escape. The application of Western science-derived methodologies, whether multivariate analysis or autoethnography, becomes suspect. This occurred even with Mara and Thompson, whose joint autoethnography had tried very candidly to deconstruct their inner female researcher beings in terms of their lived experience in parts of Africa. Science and peer review is thus sometimes characterized as a misleading, untranslatable Western import, invalidating conventional peer review. Or invalidating? I don't know. Invalidating conventional peer review. But let us not forget the Islamic germination of science before the European Enlightenment, and Louis Liebenberg's claim that the origins of science stem from Stone Age Kalahari sand tracking skills. If the results of a study are surprising or contested, then that is what is to be expected. For example, Islamic scholars were, from the 12th century, already debating interpretations of the Quran, which resulted in the discipline of hermeneutics. The religious fundamentalists nevertheless imposed a literal interpretive injunction. The historical fluidity of interpretation is the issue. One of the originating architects of hermeneutics was Averroes, Averroes, who, drawing on Greek philosophers, was the first to suggest that the Quran can be read differently by different interpretive communities under different conditions, and that philosophy and religion can generate different truths. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, archaically Latinized as Averroes, was an Andalusian Muslim polymath and jurist who wrote about many subjects including philosophy, theology, medicine, astronomy, physics, psychology, mathematics, Islamic jurisprudence, and law and linguistics. The author of more than 100 books and treatises. This philosophical work includes numerous commentaries on Aristotle, for which he was known in the Western world as the commentator and father of rationalism. Averroes was a strong proponent of Aristotelianism. Averroes attempted to restore what he considered the original teachings of Aristotle and opposed the Neoplatonist tendencies of earlier Muslim thinkers such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna. Averroes also defended the pursuit of philosophy against criticism by Ash'ari theologians such as Al-Ghazali. Averroes argued that philosophy was permissible in Islam and even compulsory among certain elites. Averroes also argued scripture text should be interpreted allegorically if it appeared to contradict conclusions reached by reason and philosophy. In Islamic jurisprudence, he wrote that Bidayat al-Mujtahid on the difference between Islamic schools of law and the principles that cause their differences. In medicine, he proposed a new theory of stroke, described the signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease for the first time, and might have been the first to identify the retina as the part of the eye responsible for sensing light. His medical book, Al-Kulliyat fi al-Tib, translated into Latin and known as Collegiate, became a textbook in Europe for centuries. Averroes's legacy in the Islamic world was modest for geographical and intellectual reasons. In the West, Averroes was known for his extensive commentaries on Aristotle, many of which were translated into Latin and Hebrew. The translations of his work reawakened Western European interest in Aristotle and Greek thinkers, an area of study that had been widely abandoned after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. His thoughts generated controversies in Latin Christendom and triggered a philosophical movement called Averroism, based on his writings. Averroes's unity of the intellect thesis, proposing that all humans share the same intellect, became one of the best known and most controversial Averroist doctrines in the West. His works were condemned by the Catholic Church in 1270 and 1277, although weakened by condemnations and sustained critique from Thomas Aquinas. Latin Averroism continued to attract followers up to the 16th century. Back to the text. One of the originating architects of hermeneutics was Averroes, who, drawing on Greek philosophers, was first to suggest that the Quran can be read differently by different interpretive communities under different conditions, and that philosophy and religion can generate different truths. In light of this bifurcation, he argued that scriptural texts should be interpreted allegorically if they appeared to contradict conclusions reached by reason and philosophy. Despite this rhetorical solution to difference, Averroes's books were burned, and he was exiled for his multiple decoding insight. There is a difference between political, religious, and academic discourses, which will always remain in creative and/or destructive tension. These instances aside, contemporary science's claim to encode traces of Western imperialism legitimized and translated through racial power. Despite the fact that the political power grid has fundamentally changed in South Africa since 1994, the common sense claim remains that the encounter with power largely continues as it did before. This is because, quote, whiteness, heterosexuality, and patriarchy claim to be a priori inscribed in the text and signifying codes of Western theory and methodologies that allegedly position its scholars within particular kinds of research practices that result in interpretations unacceptable to dissimilar scholarly constituencies. Under this scenario, there is not much to be done because the opposing constituencies or interpretive communities are located in different discursive, experiential, racial, ideological, and ethnic orbits. Little is translatable in this circuit of culture. Everything is contestable, and allegory and reason are not easily separated. As C.S. Peirce might put it, the interpretants generated from different studies by different scholars cannot be harmonized in coming to the final opinion. The rules of academic engagement or translation are losing legitimacy, while rhetorical truth claims linked to constituency legitimation are now ascending, as Merritt have averred with regard to UCT. If methods, theories, and analyses contain traces of global, regional, or local power, these are what need to be identified, balanced, and debated. All interactions are underpinned by power relations, and we are all subjects of these in one way or another. These debates will intensify as they really are about who has the power to define preferred meaning, to entrench, legitimate, and authorize that meaning, and to delimit who can confer meaning. Western science, argue some decolonialists, must remain in the West. African science, in asserting its regional power, must prevail in Africa. Doing research can thus be a tricky business, and especially in the humanities, where, quote, lived conditions are invoked by researchers who apply the IES framework without due problematization. For Hull, there is, quote, some plausibility to the idea that in certain areas of social relations, those who have first-hand experience of or have been on the receiving end of particular phenomena will tend to be more proactive and effective at articulating the nature of those phenomena, end quote. However, Hall cautions that, quote, one cannot justifiably make the leap from this observation to a general theory about the ability of different categories of people to attain and communicate knowledge, end quote. Hull concludes that universities, quote, must not lose sight of the access to truth, which systematic study of first-hand accounts, constructing and testing the coherence of reasoned theoretical explanations, and testing hypotheses against bodies of evidence can provide. Practitioners' ability to attain and communicate knowledge in an academic field should be assessed on the basis of individual accomplishments, not inferred from highly speculative general theories about the epistemic impact of intersecting matrices of power on categories of person, end quote. Hull. In discussion with Hull, we are agreed that the Natros affair reveals two incompatible paradigms. First, the different groups possess different knowledges. Quote, never the twain shall meet, end quote. They just need to get on with knowing separately in their different worlds. Second, different groups have different expertise areas arising from their respective identities, and therefore certain deliverances to Group 1 on the basis of its identity simply need to be taken on trust and obeyed by Group G2. The same ambivalence occurs with some of the coloniality theorists critiqued by Hull. Concludes Hull, quote, I guess I see these as two tactical moves in the politics of knowledge, which are not compatible, and neither of which has more than very limited plausibility in the end, but which suits actors in different contexts, end quote. Hull. New section. Implications for journals. New section 5. Implications for journals. The implications for journal editors and for collegial relations and professional civility, if the above-mentioned responses are indicative, could be as follows. 1. Incivility will occur more frequently as intellectually stimulated moral panics put pressure on editors, peer review processes, and commentary selection. In the Natros case, a campaign by her outraged detractors, including politicians, immediately and widely publicized in the digital media, resulted in her being identified by both academic critics and certain newspapers as being a folk devil, though not using this demonizing theoretical terminology. The indigenous term invoked by the mischievous Sunday Times was mampara, lacking intelligence, a derogatory expression reserved for the worst of the worst transgressors of public integrity, in its irreverent Hogarth column. An associated public demand for restitution to the perceived transgression is the challenge. ASSAF has taken the lead in examining national issues with truly multidisciplinary lenses that seek a best consensus in its various reports that pursue, quote, the final option, end quote. Peirce's thesis explains how knowledge is possible, but Peirce argues that the epistemic status of the thesis itself is dependent on the course of experience and interpretation by scholars. Simultaneously, ASSAF tries to remain loyal to the principles of objectivity, evidence neutrality, and logical argument. Even so, subjectivity is recognized as one of the necessary and important ingredients of any proposed set of solutions. Ensuring desirable degrees of collegiality in academe needs to transcend the impact of identity essentialism. Academic rules of engagement would have suggested that criticism of them be first raised in the journal's pages themselves. Science progresses through dialogue, dialectical argument, and debate. controversies such as occurred with the Natras study should offer, quote, a teachable moment, end quote, as was the case with an earlier published paper stemming from Stellenbosch University that was alleged to invoke racial stereotypes that prompted that institution, quote, to reflect afresh upon the challenges of transforming our institutional culture, end quote. With regard to the moral panic unleashed over the Natras commentary, Aesop and Long's caution is that, quote, it is significant that intellectuals now see fit to take their first responses to news outlets rather than academic journals. If Natras's commentary was so ill-informed, it should have been coolly dismantled in the pages of the South African Journal of Science, end quote. But Aesop and Long themselves got stick from their peers who questioned Natras for responding in the press to criticisms of her commentary. Is she and her team therefore to be doubly silenced? 2. The current tendency of enraged critics is to play the person and not the ball, or rather, and thus to act as both referee and player. For example, the editors of ASR issued a public statement condemning behavior that included threats of violence with regard to the Mara and Thompson ethnography. If science practice involves inquiry, then that's the ball to be played, respecting the rules of the game. 3. The Natras commentary similarly touched raw underlying historical nerves that have been bubbling under the discursive ideological surface, the same ones that brought Black Lives Matter into recent prominence in the United States during 2019. Black Lives Matter and, quote, decolonization of knowledge, end quote, are two sides of the same coin. Social science, unlike humanities, is rooted in the search for concrete and verifiable evidence, and explanations are extrapolated from statistical correspondences. However, most academic inquiry now accepts the truth that what Peirce calls the final opinion is a moving target, often split into multiple final opinions, plural rather than singular. Indeed, some humanities scholars espouse a different kind of logic, propelled by often intuitive and inductive methods that, quote, assert and, quote, will argue, rather than looking for, quote, findings and patterns arising out of the data itself. That is, the final opinion is anticipated without having to do any empirical work. Indeed, as some of Natras's critics asserted, the reading of her social science studies can be boring, lacking as they do experiential human dimensions of feelings. Yet the numerical methods that characterize social science can often generate unexpected results. The issue then is to draw inferences and look for correlations in explaining the data that resulted from informant information. When asserting an already known outcome, there can be little opportunity for surprise. So, when the numbers contradict what is, quote, already a priori known, end quote, it is then rhetorically argued that the interpretations or the application of scientific method applied must be wrong or unacceptable, and if deemed wrong by ideological common sense, then in such cases it is the author who becomes the target, along with the ethics committee that approved the study. The divergences in practices of criticism are now global. Footnote: see the letter of which Noam Chomsky and Todd Gitlin are signatories, published in Harper's Magazine 2020. Then a, quote, counterblast was issued by a different set of signatories on the objective.substack. This replying letter trades on what the Harper's Magazine letter cautions against: innuendo, naming, and shaming. End footnote. 5. Moral panics are emerging as the preferred method of social media conveyed contemporary author expression, a consequence of digitization where anyone can engage instantly and globally. Thinking, reflecting, placing oneself in the shoes of the other, dialecticism, and developing arguments for research, letters over a time of reflection and revision that do not slide along on blame are being lost in an environment driven by digital immediacy. In the past, newspaper sub-editors were the much maligned gatekeepers. They checked facts, asked for evidence, and constructed often sensationalist headlines, and implicitly towed the institutional ideological line. The mediating role of these gatekeepers is now largely lost, and with it due caution as to what is published on the internet. On the one hand, this is democratization, but on the other, we may be losing sight of the wood for the trees. Hopefully, clarity might appear in dialogue between opposing positions. One second. Yeah, I think I'm going to cut this video in half now.